Welcome everyone to Unleash the Power of Visual Studio Code. My name is Aaron Powell and I'm here to hopefully teach you some tips and tricks about how we can use Visual Studio Code over the next hour or so. As I said, my name is Aaron Powell. I'm a principal cloud advocate at Microsoft. So part of my job is talking to folks like yourselves about all things that are that at least I find are interesting that are happening in tech and stuff like that. But I've been a web developer for 15 years or so, and I've had an opportunity to use pretty much every style of editor under the sun. I remember working back when I was working on like Linux machines and stuff like that with editors like Nano and Pico and Ed and Jed and Emacs and VI and all that sort of stuff to when I moved into Windows development, like Visual Studio, and then even lightweight Windows editors such as like Notepad++ and Sublime and stuff like that. There's a bunch of places that you can find me on social media. I also have a little bot that's hanging out in the Slack channel, and they're going to be posting a bunch of links throughout today. So if there's things that you want to find out more about that I maybe haven't put the link up for long enough or didn't put a link up at all for, check out the Track 5 Slack channel, and you'll see that the Aaron Powell's service is going to be posting things as we go along. But you didn't hear to come hear me and my history and things like that. You've come to learn about VS Code and what we can do with that. Now, I'm sure that a number of people on the session today have already used VS Code and are familiar with what they can do with it. But I still want this session to have something for you. Whether it is some of the first time that you've seen VS Code and you've had a chance to see some of the use cases for it, well, I still hope that there's something that you can even that you take away from it as well. I've been using VS Code since some of its early releases, so hopefully I can share maybe some tips and tricks that you might not have come across. Also, this scene, let's feel like we're a bit more at an event. I'm just going to jump behind my desk here so it feels like I'm in a conference hall because we want to pretend that we're actually in person at an NDC event, and just standing in front of like a translucent background that I have of Sydney, it's not quite the right feeling that I want to go for. Anyway, VS Code, Visual Studio Code as it is short for, is an Electron application. So this is a lightweight text editor that's designed to be cross-platform. Interesting enough, VS Code is actually written with WebTech. It's written in HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. That's the core of what VS Code is and the way that we can work with it. So if we're doing extensibility and things like that, we get to work with it from a JavaScript developer's perspective. And because it's cross-platform, it means that if I'm working on a Linux machine or Mac OS or Windows, well, I get the same editor experience. And that means that when I'm working in a team environment, I don't have to worry about, well, my colleagues that are working on Mac, they're going to be using a completely different style of editor and a different editor experience that I'd be using when I'm on Windows. By having that normalization, it means that we can all be, at least in my experience, a lot more productive because we're working on the same sort of experience towards what we're trying to build. Now, vanilla VS Code, so when you first install it, is really simplistic. It doesn't have much in the way of functionality. It understands some of the basic and common programming languages that you'll come across, like JavaScript and the .NET languages, Java, Python, etc. But it doesn't kind of do a whole lot else. That's where we can extend it and customize it to suit the kinds of needs that we have. So let's just have a quick look around VS Code so that we're all on the same page. Like I said, some people, it might be some of the first times that they've been seeing VS Code or had a chance to really dive into it. So I just want to make sure that I've got all the terminology that I use to talk about VS Code and describe things the same for everyone so that we don't get lost partway down it. So this is VS Code open in a project that I have. And let's just focus in on a couple parts of the editor. First off, we have the title bar here across the top. Every application under the sun has probably had a title bar at some point in its life. But what makes the VS Code title bar interesting is that while we've got our menu system, file, edit, selection, etc., then there is index.html, which is the file I've got open, React folder, which is the project I've got open on a remote host in WSL, and then it's the VS Code inside it. Well, all of that is customizable. I can actually change the information that's available in that title bar. So maybe I don't need to know the remote that I'm connected to, or I want some additional information in there. Well, I can put that in there by modifying that with inside of settings. Also, just as a side note, the stuff that I'm going to do today will be shown in VS Code Insiders, but by and large, it's going to be applicable to VS Code Stable. I just tend to use Insiders because I like to play with the new and shiny things. So every now and then there might be something that doesn't work or doesn't work quite the same way in stable, but anticipate that that'll be coming in the not too distant future. Next up, we have our sidebar. And our sidebar here is where we can then interact with things like the file system, our debugger, our source control provider, but I've also got a couple of extensions installed that are provided for functionality. I've got a Azure extension and a Docker extension, for example, and these extensions have just added some stuff to our sidebar there, so I can do some additional functionality. They'll appear in this kind of tree hierarchy that I've got, so that it provides whatever is relevant there for Azure, like inspecting through our subscription and resource groups, so on and so forth. Across the bottom, we have a status bar. And a status bar is another place that extensions can provide us with information, and the way that the editor itself provides us with information. We've got things like our line number and column position. What's the Git status and what branch are we on? We have line encodings and so on and so forth. But all of that stuff we can customize for what we need and the way that we want VS Code to work. Maybe I'm not interested in the number of indentations I've got, that it's spaces and it's a two depth indent. So I can remove that by modifying that within settings. Again, customizing the editor to show the information that's most important to me. Above the status bar, we have our terminal, as well as some other things like the debug console, our problems, which are where the extensions or the IntelliSense engine might be giving us information about our application, saying there's a compile error on line 7 of some file that I need to go and check out. So that's all appearing there inside our terminal. This integrated terminal will then use the default terminal of the operating system you're connected to. So in this case, it's connected to a Linux machine. So it's running ZSH, which is my default shell there. But on Windows, like PowerShell, Mac OS, if you Bash, or whatever you've configured as your default shell within inside of Mac OS. And then, of course, we actually have a place where we can edit a text file. I mean, it's a lot of stuff that I've talked about that VS Code has in it, without actually talking about the fact that it's a text editor. So, you can edit text in it, right? Like that kind of makes sense. Yeah. And it has the things that you expect from a modern text editor: syntax highlighting, line gaps, so we can see where indentations are matching up, so on and so forth. This is just a theme that I've got for a dark theme, but there's plenty of themes out there. You can modify the colorization to the way that you want to. Finally, we have our mini-map on the right-hand side. The mini-map gives us like a 10,000-foot view of the code file that I've currently got open. And because I understand the colorization that I've got set up for this particular file, I can see that this is very HTML heavy at the top. So that's going to be like the meta tags, the title tag and stuff inside of my head. And then it's mostly comments. And it's because this is a React application, there's really just a single element the React is going to be injecting itself into. But you can imagine that if you're working on, say, a compile language like a .NET language or TypeScript compiling to JavaScript, if you had like an error or a warning inside of that, we'll see some colorization inside of that that indicates, well, this is where I might have an error that I've got to go and investigate, so I can use the mini-map to jump down to that quickly. And as I said, this is like a 10,000-foot view, so you can quickly see the whole of the code file that you've got open and navigate up and down. So if you're working with large code files, you can easily jump up and down instead of having to manually scroll hundreds of lines of code files. Not that we'd ever write one file that's like a few thousand lines long. That would be a terrible idea and very poor approach to doing programming, wouldn't it? I've never totally done that in my career either. So the first thing I want to talk about when we actually go into VS Code is how to be productive. I think that's really where I can give some tips and tricks based off of my experience. But being productive is somewhat of a subjective term, at least. The way that I think of productivity in the tools that I work with is probably different to the way most people think of it. We all have our own styles and approaches to the way that we work. But for me, I'm a keyboard user. So I love being able to use keyboard shortcuts and keyboard-based navigation to get around, whether it's an editor that I'm working in or the terminal that I'm on and all that sort of stuff. VS Code has a lot of stuff that we can do just from the keyboard. So that's enough slides for now. Let's head over to VS Code and actually check that out. If I can find the right editor, there we go. So here is VS Code, and yes, you are going to be able to see the notes that I've pre-written. So feel free to read ahead and then just kind of tune out for the next little bits until I scroll down further. the first thing, and if there is nothing else that you take away from this talk, is the shortcut key of Control P, or if you're on Mac, Command P. Now I'm on Windows, so I will be using the Windows shortcuts, which are control based, but anywhere that I'm using control, you can replace with command on a Mac keyboard layout. So Control P brings up our command palette. Our command palette is where we can do a whole variety of different things. One of the first things we can do from the command palette that I'll show off is if I put a greater than symbol, and then this takes me into the action list. This is everything that I can do with inside of VS Code, available straight from my keyboard, and I can just type in the things I want to do. I'm going to turn on something called screencast mode. A screencast mode is just going to make sure that it pops up on screen the keyboard key presses that I'm doing. This way that, well, you can't actually see the keyboard. I didn't set up that camera angle as well, like, a top-down camera, so you could watch me. I'm not that hardcore a Twitch streamer to have that set up yet. But you still probably want to know the keyboard shortcuts that I'm pressing to achieve things. So Control P, back into our command palette. If I provide a question mark, then this is all the things I can do from the command palette itself. There's, by default, it's navigate around the different files. So it's going to list files that have recently been opened in the order that they were recently opened in. Whereas I could type in something new. So if I was typing license, and then I can jump through to the license file that's within inside of this, just by doing a fuzzy match on that inside of the search box. Again, from the command palette, I can do an @ symbol, which will then provide me with all of the symbols within inside of the entire solution that I'm working on. So this is this is predominantly Markdown, so it's just giving me a whole bunch of Markdown headers. Instead, let's jump over to another project that I have open, which is an F# project. If I was to do Control P and then do the @ symbol, so now I can find all of the types that are within inside of this particular file. There is a parent record, and it's got members. I've got like our family record down here, and you can see that as I'm moving through this, it's finding that part within inside the file and navigating up and down. So @ allows me to navigate through the current file, whereas if I was to use hash instead, or the £, this is all symbols across the entire workspace that I've got open. I can type in parent again, and this will find me that record type, and I can jump through to that. It doesn't do the kind of in-file navigation because you can be navigating across multiple files, and then that would get very complex as an editor experience. You're kind of bouncing back and forth between files as you're kind of moving up and down because the symbols are just listed in alphabetical order. But yeah, so Control P, and then hash if I want to look at symbols across the entire workspace I've got open, @ if I want symbols within inside the current workspace. Now, the next thing I want to show off from the command palette is if we type term, this gives us access to the terminal. I've got a terminal instance that's already open, so I can pop that here. You see I was doing a commit earlier and adding some stuff to my my notes, but now I'm in my terminal, and I've used the keyboard to jump through to this, and I can navigate around. Just do ls so we know which one we're at. I can do Command P, term, create, and I can create a new terminal. So this is useful. I find this quite useful when I'm doing like a node application. I might be running like an npm start because that's for the front end, and then npm start for the back end. Run those as two separate terminals. I could then have a third terminal where I'm doing like my Git operations and stuff like that. But it can be a little bit tedious jumping around. It's like, oh, well, they're all named the same based off of the shell. So one's called ZSH, then the next one's ZSH. How do I know which one I want to jump to? Well, from the actions, so back to that greater than symbol, I can type terminal rename. And let's rename this one as, we'll call this Git. And now if I go back term, I can see that name is in there. And if I was type Git, it navigates through the correct terminal. So this now can navigate up and down quite easily. And again, just optimizing the ways that we can work with our terminal and our editor itself. The last thing is if I type view, this gives me access to the sidebar. Everything that's available in the sidebar, including what extensions are provided me, I can navigate through. So if I wanted to jump through to, let's say, extensions, I can jump to that. And then now I am able to work with inside of my extensions there. Come back to view and then say, let's jump through to the output. Output, there we go. This is like if I was doing if I had a compilation step, then I could jump through the output window and see that there. Okay, navigating around the editor as fast as is relevant for me but just entirely doing that from the keyboard. Okay, so that's the command palette and how we can kind of use that as a way to speed up how we work around the editor. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Zen mode. Now, if you're like me and someone that can be quite distractible, if I press Control-K, Z, I can jump into Zen mode. Zen mode basically removes all of the stuff that I don't really need to see. Maybe if I'm writing a blog post or I'm trying to just like really get in the zone on a particular problem, do I need the status bar across the bottom? Do I need the sidebar there? You know, all of that kind of stuff. No, I just want to look at this one particular file, and I can use Zen mode to navigate to to kind of hone in what I'm focusing on there. Also from Zen mode, if I jump into settings properly, Zen mode, I can toggle what I do and don't want in there. So maybe I do actually want like the line numbers. At the moment, it's hiding line numbers, but I kind of still want line numbers. Let's go back into Zen mode. Unfortunately, when you change Zen mode settings, you've got to go in and out of it. I can turn line numbers back on because I still find that useful. I want that bit of context there. So we can do that. And there's other things like you can have maybe the status bar up here if you still want that information. So you can kind of minimize it down to just what you need to see and have that there as you want. We'll drop out of Zen mode and just back into regular VS Code view. Next up is rulers. So we can set guidelines with inside of our editor. And I'm just going to come into the JSON version of the settings file, just because it's easier for me to demonstrate some of this stuff. So what I've done is I've actually already added this in. I'm just going to Control-K, Control-U to uncomment. And I am missing a comma on line 706. There we go. So editor rules allow me to put guidelines into the text that are kind of just drawn over the top of everything else that's there. Now, we can put as many of these as we want, and you might be like, well, what could be some use cases for having this in there? What I see as one of the best use cases for this is that if you're wanting to make sure that you're keeping to a certain width of your code base, why would you want to do that? I know a lot of old school developers like to use kind of an 80 character wide editor screen, and that's all that I would fix to because that was kind of what terminals were back in the day. But we kind of moved on. We've got 4K monitors now, and I can fit like hundreds of characters width across in my text editor. So why do I want a gutter that tells me I don't want to go past 80 characters? Well, one of the reasons that you might want to do that is if you're working with someone that has maybe some vision impairments. You want to make sure that they're not constantly having to scroll left and right because you're working on a 4K monitor with tiny font size and I can comfortably read 500 characters wide in the text editor, but maybe they can't. So this can be just a useful way that you can see, oh, hang on a sec, line's getting a bit long. We want to put a wrap in here just so that we can make sure that everyone is included as well as we can. But I'm going to remove those just for the moment with Control-K, Control-C to insert a comment because there's other things that I want to carry on. So I know that you won't be able to read like the VS Code menus and stuff like that. Where I do want to touch some of those beyond the command palette, I can't actually zoom that in, unfortunately. There's no way that I've found in VS Code to increase the font size of the command palette, but I will zoom the editor in a bit later because I've got a couple of things that I want to show off. But I do know that this is not the most optimal way to experience the editor. Unfortunately, I'm constrained a little bit by technology here. Okay, the next thing is code actions on save. Now, you might be kind of wondering what that means. Well, in VS Code, anything that's available from the action list, so there's Control-Shift-P, if it's related to modifying a code file, I can have it perform that action when I save. Now, a useful thing for doing this might be that you're wanting to format a document on save so that it complies with sort of the linting rules or whatever you're targeting there. But there's other things that we might want to do just from a stylistic standpoint. I'm going to jump over to a JavaScript file that I've got here, which is conveniently called code actions on save. And well, I want to order the import statements I have in this file alphabetically. So at the moment I've got path and then I've imported FS directly after that. So I can go Control-Shift-P and bring up the command palette, and then I can do organize import statements. So this will then just reorder them around. And that works, that's fine, I can do that. But it's a little bit tedious that I have to remember to do that each time. I want to do that whenever I save a file. So again, we'll jump back to our settings, and I'll come up to the top to where I've got this square brackets JavaScript. That's an indicator of these are going to be, let me move my cursor out of the way, settings rules that are applied only to the JavaScript language. So in here, I can do editor.code actions on save. And then what do I want to do? See, these it's automatically picked up some code actions that I already have. Fix all, so if I'm using a linter like ESLint, it will be able to then just apply the ESLint fixes when I save the file. But I've also got organize imports. And then let's set that to true. Save that. And now if I come back to our code actions on save, just hit Control S, it's automatically run that action for me. Small quality of life improvements that you can have. This is not changing the world or anything like that, but it's just the little tips and tricks that can get you, avoid something like you've got to remember to run a particular command or perform a particular step as you're navigating through. Just going to undo all this stuff so that I don't forget later on when I'm doing my talk next time that I have to undo them and that my demos are still going to work. Controlling line numbers. So I have line numbers turned on. I love having line numbers turned on because I find it a very useful thing for me to have. But some people, maybe they have like distraction issues and you don't want line numbers there. So we can do that if we come into settings. Actually, I'll use the settings UI for this one. We go line numbers. And let me just zoom this in a little bit. Here we go. Okay, so I can set line numbers in the setting is defaults to on. I can turn them off, and then if we pop into our file, then unsurprisingly, the line numbers are turned off. Now, the text is also getting massive because I've zoomed the editor in, which is going to take the 30 font text and then apply the zoom on top of that, which is one of the reasons why I didn't leave the editor zoomed in the entire time. So we will be kind of zooming in and out of the editor as we play around with a bunch of stuff. Okay, so we've turned line numbers off, but then there's a couple of other things that we've got in there. We've got relative and interval. Let's start with relative. Relative line numbers means that relative to the cursor, it's going to then count forwards and backwards from it. So I'm on line 82, and then above it is line 1, and below it is line 1. Or the way that I think of it is we've got -1 and +1 from line 82. So where would this be useful? Let's say that you're using an extension like the Vim extension so that you can do, because you're used to VI and you want to use that and the power of the macros and stuff that you can do in there. They'll often have operations that you can perform that are on relative lines. So from this line, what is 6 above? I can do the mental maths on that, and that is going to be 76. But well, I can see where 6 above is, and that's the one that I want to work with. It can be also useful if you're doing pair programming, and someone is like, "Oh, can you go up to like 3 lines above because that's where we want to have a look." Okay, which one they're talking about? There it is. And yeah, so we'll always move around relative to the cursor. That's what it means by relative. The final option is interval. Interval will then only show line numbers every 10 lines and the current line that you're on. So line 80 is unsurprisingly 2 above. There's 82. We scroll down, we've got line 90. I don't have anything below that, but there's line 70, 60, so on and so forth. So again, just that can be useful. Again, if you're someone that has attention issues and you might want to just reduce the amount of visual noise that is on the screen. I'm going to jump it back to on because that's what I prefer, and I'm just going to zoom the editor back out for the time being. Like I said, we'll zoom things in as is needed. Inside of our Explorer, actually, and now I kind of need to zoom back in. But zoom in. Whoa, my editor is just, it's having some conniptions right now. There we go. It's changed some settings on me, and I'm not sure what those settings are. I seem to have a new themes being applied. Well, that's fun. In VS Code, if we create a new, let's say I want to create a new file and I want to put it in a certain folder. I do this really commonly if I'm creating a GitHub Actions workflow. Well, I can create the full file path inside of here. So I can do .github workflows, and we'll call this main.yaml. That's then going to either put it in that path or create those folders if they don't exist. Sweet. This one for me was just such a game changer when I realized that you could do that. is because I click like right click new folder, then right click on the folder, and then do new folder, and then create the file within inside of that. But being able to just write out the path I did enter and then have it create that for me, that's super useful that I find. Okay, and then the very last one, we'll zoom back out, and let's just change my theme. Actually, let's go Control Shift P. Where's my command palette theme? Let's go back to my color theme that I had before. It was that one. Actually, no. Let's go a bit cyberpunky for the rest of the session. Yeah, we'll go a bit more like that. Or do we want? Let's go with some purple theme colors. Yeah, that'll do. That'll do nicely. The last setting that I want to cover off is if I come back into the settings JSON file, is that I can set the default language for files when I create. So I can Control N. This has created just a plain text file. But, well, maybe I want it to be a JavaScript file because that's the file that that's the file type that I'm working with. So I'm just going to copy this across. And let's go, we'll pop our comma in, and then we do file default language. So this is the default language of new files when they're created. I can do JavaScript. I can do JavaScript. I can type. There we go. Now if I go Control N, oops, sorry, it's supposed to have the square brackets around it. And then we do Control N. And then that should be import to from, no. Oh, I've got my syntax incorrect. This is where, like, you don't go off script when you're presenting. What I actually wanted to show is that you can use active editor language. So this is a dynamic variable provided by VS Code. And what it'll do is it'll work out the language of the editor that you've got open, well, the most commonly used language, and then default the file to that. So if you're working in a JavaScript project, it'll default to JavaScript files. If you're in a .NET project or a C# project, it's C#. If you're in, when I'm running my blog, it defaults to Markdown because the majority of the content is in Markdown. But that's enough in generalized settings. Let's jump over to my next one, which is keyboard shortcuts. Now, as I said, I'm going to cover off a bunch of keyboard shortcuts that are for Windows, so I'll be using Control, but Command is going to be the Mac equivalent for what you need. Now, with this, actually, I'm just going to double check. If I do that, whoa, it did flip my theme again very quickly. Oh, no, Control Plus does actually affect the command palette, so fantastic. That could be a little bit more zoomed in for folks. Let's just do one more plus on that. Okay, so as I said, Control P, command palette, and then we can do a bunch of stuff off of there. Question mark is the way that you want to find out all the things that you can do. If you want to get to settings, Control comma, that'll jump through to your settings with inside of VS Code. Really easy shortcut to use, particularly if you're wanting changing things frequently. And then there's a little icon in the top right corner that will open the JSON version of the settings if that's the way that you prefer to work. Also, some settings you can't do through the UI. Code actions. Code actions, like I showed with inside of the command palette, where I do Control-Shift-P and the organized using statements, they also appear as a little light bulb that, here we go, that I have such as down here. You can see that little light bulb sitting just above the double pound sign for this header. And if I do Control period, it will bring up that code action of what I want to do. Now, this is some spell checking that's happening. And so, oh, I don't recognize that word. Here's the options that could be. But if this is like a .NET project, it will give you the options to refactor. If it's a refactoring you're trying to do, and so on and so forth. Okay. If you want to duplicate the line, Alt-Shift-Up will duplicate the line above you. So down will go down, up will go above, as normally would make sense, and the cursor stays in the direction that you're going. If you want to do box selection, so multi-line selection, Control-Alt-Shift, and then the direction that you want to select, up or down. And then from that, you could do a Control-Shift to do a box selection from that, which will then jump over words, or I can do a single character selection. If I'm working on a larger screen, I can use Control backslash, forward slash to split the editor across to the right. I can then do Control K, Control slash, which could split the editor below. So if I was working on a widescreen display or a 4K display or something like that, I can open up multiple windows all simultaneously. It will split the editor with the currently open file. So you will actually end up with two copies of the same file open, but that's easy. You then just close it in the one that it's no longer relevant for. If we want to select, let's say that I want to change this into the Mac equivalence instead of the Windows equivalence, I can do Control D, and that will select the next match of what I've currently got selected. So I can do Control D and select all of those controls and turn that to CMD. But because I didn't do like a Control H to do a find and replace, I haven't replaced the one that's above on line 7 because I didn't need to replace that one. If I do an escape, it'll take me back to where the cursor started from, and then let's just Control Z to undo all of that. So while Zen mode's useful for being able to minimize everything, maybe we just want to collapse so we've got a bigger text editor surface, which is kind of useful, particularly when I'm zoomed in like this. So I can collapse the sidebar on the left-hand side there with Control B. Control B naturally will bring it back. I'm not going to be covering off all the keyboard shortcuts, but if you want to learn more keyboard shortcuts, Control K, Control R will then open up the keyboard shortcuts PDF file relevant to your current operating system. So I've landed in the Windows ones, but on Mac or Linux, you would end up with the right ones there. I'm just going to kick some stuff off in the background that we'll need a bit later on. If I want to move a line, Alt up and down will just move that line in the direction I want, whereas Control will just fix the cursor in that place and navigate the window up and down. If you're working on a strongly typed language or a language that has symbols that it can detect usages of, it's like TypeScript, JavaScript files that are marked up with JSDoc, .NET languages, so on and so forth, F12 will allow us to navigate around that. And then finally, if we're in a Markdown file, we'll do Control K, V, and I can get a preview of what that Markdown file will look like. Just pop there on the side. Phew, that's a lot. And we're only 30 minutes into the session, but that's a lot of stuff for VS Code. Let's jump back down now to our slides. If I can find them here. There we go. And the next thing I want to just touch a bit on is snippets. So code snippets are a way that we can add things to our function, add commonly written things to our editor, and then just be able to insert them quickly. One use case that I have for this is when I'm doing demos, I don't actually like to type out the demo. I will use a code snippet to just quickly insert what's actually going to be going in place. It could be that you're using it to enforce a particular pattern that you've got, like if you're creating React components, here's how we want to lay out a new file with a React component in it. If I'm working with like an open source project and maybe I want a licensing header in there, I can have one that will automatically insert a licensing header, all that sort of stuff. Snippets are able to be applied at the user level, so something that's available for all my instances of VS Code. I can also put them into a .vs code folder inside of the repo that I'm working on, which applies them to only that particular repository when it's open, or that workspace. This is useful because then I can check that into source control, and then those snippets are available to anyone that also works on the repository. Again, useful for enforcing patterns or layout format coding formats that we've got within inside of our application, and making it easier for someone else to pick up and contribute in the format that we want people to contribute in. If you're working on a multi-line snippets, they can be a little bit tricky to set up, just because it ends up in a like a JSON blob. So I just posted a link in Slack to a little tool I found that can help you generate code snippets from chunks of code that can be inserted into VS Code. So yeah, check out Slack if you want to have a look at that. The next thing I want to talk about is extensions. Now, look, everyone's going to want, I have opinions on what extensions are the best extensions to install, and these are their favorite extensions, and that's going to be different if you're a .NET developer versus a JavaScript developer versus a Python developer. So instead, I want to touch on 6 extensions that I think are really useful general purpose extensions, regardless of what kind of usages you have for VS Code. And they are appearing very shortly when my animations run in PowerPoint. Ta-da! VS Code, editor config for VS Code. This one I use a lot for enforcing code standards. Editor config is a file format for defining a file layout. So things like file encodings, indent types, stuff like that. Now, if I've got a repository that I have like a bash script in there to be run on my Unix or a Mac system, well, I probably want to enforce that as an LF line ending, whereas on Windows, I have PowerShell scripts and I want them as CRLF instead. So I can use editor config to say, no, anything that's like .sh, it's going to have LF, whereas everything that's .ps1, that's going to be enforced as CRLF. But we can also use that to enforce a variety of other coding standards. And this is the sort of thing that makes it easy if I'm coming to an open source project and trying to pick that up. Well, I can see and I can have their coding standards enforced for me. Next across is Peacock. Peacock was actually written by a colleague of mine called John Popper, and it's an extension that I've actually had running that does some subtle changes to the workspace so that it's easy to kind of see which workspaces you might be in, especially if you've got multiple windows open. So this one has Peacock running, and that's where I'm getting the green border around my editor in VS Code. So as you can see, as I'm pressing Alt-Tab, I actually have a bunch of other VS Codes open. So how do I know which one I want to navigate to? Let's jump over to my F# project here. Control-Shift-P and do Peacock. Surprise me with a random color. Let's see what we get. Cool, we've got a lovely fuchsia color there. And now when I'm Alt-Tabbing, I know which one's which as I'm tabbing back and forth. The way this works is it adds some stuff to the local settings file. It just modifies some local VS Code settings only for this particular workspace. So it's only applied to this particular project, not for all the other workspaces that I have open. That's why it's in this editor and not in any of the others. Come back to our slides. GitHub pull requests and issues. If you're working with GitHub, this is kind of a must-have extension. It gives you all the power of the things that you would be doing through the editor UI, things like merging pull requests and approving them, reviewing them. I can do all of that directly from VS Code. I don't have to jump to the web UI to do that or jump to like the GitHub desktop application to do that. I just do it from VS Code. It can also save you if you don't want to have like multiple bits of software installed that kind of all overlap with each other. Again, do it from the one location. Code spell check, mostly because I am someone that can spell words horrendously sometimes. I have that installed so I can make sure that I don't incorrectly spell something in the code base or when I'm writing blog posts. Funny story is that a number of years ago, I was working at a agency and we were building a project for a customer where we had a database table that was accidentally named person name his Troy. We didn't realize until a bit later on we'd written all the code that interacted with that table. Our ORM was all implemented, and we went, oh, it's person name his Troy, not history. And it was just too much effort to go back and fix it. If we had something like code spell checker, well, we probably wouldn't have hit that problem. REST client is very similar functionality to what you get out of like Postman or Insomniac and stuff like that. But being in VS Code, it is able to take advantage of the actual like the text editor itself. So you can write a file using the DSL that they've defined that has the like REST commands that you want to execute. So then the REST commands, like you might have a bunch that are just like testing the way your API works. Well, you can have that checked in as source code so that when someone else picks up the project, they can just select it, run it, and actually just see it working. They don't have to have another tool and find the Postman collection and make sure they've got Postman installed and all that sort of stuff. Again, it's simple quality of life things that I'm looking at here. And then lastly, to do highlight, it's probably fairly self-explanatory what it does. It just makes it easy to find all those whack to-dos that you put with inside of your code base. You're like, I will definitely come back and fix that thing that I said I was going to fix, won't I? Yeah, we know you will. This just makes it, this actually pops up in the problems area with inside of VS Code, so you can easily jump around. You combine that with like the GitHub pull requests and issues. It allows you to just select the text and generate a GitHub issue straight from that. So you can just be commenting your code, annotating it as you're going along, and then easily turn those into issues inside of your environment, in your repository. Well, we've talked a lot about how we can customize VS Code for your usage, but what I learned when I was doing consulting is that there's nothing more frustrating than coming to a new project and then having someone come over and go, welcome, it's your first day, here's your computer, and then dropping like 100 sheets of paper on my desk going, and this is how you go and set up your machine. We'll see you at the end of the week. And you're like, okay, so what software do I need to install? What editors do I have? What extensions do I need? Where do I need to lay things out on the file system? So on and so forth. I'm sure that a lot of us have experienced that sort of thing. Or maybe you're trying to contribute to an open source project and your pull request was rejected because you didn't realize that they had a particular linting rule in force, or that they had they needed it tested in a certain way. Well, that could be really like off-putting as someone who wants to contribute to an open source project, because you've got this barrier to entry that I didn't realize until I got a rejection from you. Well, the way that we can do environment standardization in VS Code starts with the .vs Code folder. We saw that briefly before with Peacock, is we can have a settings.json file, which we can set local settings for our workspace. Let's actually jump over to VS Code and to another one that I've got open here and have a look at a way that we could implement this quite extensively. So this is the settings template that we have for the TypeScript code base. So this is a bunch of stuff that they've got that they want people to have in their kind of enforced. So it's going to be setting, it's going to be using ESLint, and this is the way that it validates ESLint. Here's the path to the ESLint rules that they've got, so on and so forth. So like me as someone who wants to come and contribute to this project, I don't need to know more than the fact that they've got ESLint installed. But, well, how do I know, to run that sort of stuff? Well, we can define extensions, and we can define recommended extensions that you have inside of your environment. So it's saying that, well, we recommend that you have the VS Code ESLint and a live reload extension installed, because that's going to be, that's the things that we use as the maintainers of the open source project, and it's encouraging you to also make sure you have the same thing there. We can also say we've got unwanted extensions. So here are extensions that we know are going to have a conflict. So make sure you uninstall those before working on the project. But that gets us a certain part of the way. But we've really pushed the onus onto the person that's working on the project. They have to make sure that they are setting up their environment based off of our rules, and we can kind of give them hints along the way. Instead, we can look at VS Code dev containers. Dev containers are a way to use a Docker container to set up a development environment. Now, I might not have Rust on my machine, but I want to experiment with Rust. Well, do I go out and install that and all those sorts of things? No, I can put down a dev container that has that pre-installed. Or as someone who's on an open source project, maybe I'm giving you a dev container. So I'm controlling the environment that you've got set up so that when you're coming to the project, you don't have to go out and install a bunch of different tools. You make sure you have the right version of Node installed, so on and so forth. From a development team standpoint, this would be useful to standardize our environment. But we can even go to the point of creating a Docker container where we have like just a local dev database inside of that Docker container when it's running, so that you have this fully self-contained dev environment. You don't need to then make sure you go and install the right version of MySQL or the right version of Mongo so that you can do your development. A dev container, if I jump over to a project that I have open here, this is actually running in a dev container. This is a .NET project of mine, and I've defined a .devcontainer.json file. Let's zoom in now, editor a touch. Yep, let's collapse off our terminal. So I have this .dev containers folder, and inside of that, I have a dev containers.json and a Docker file. So the Docker file is, for all intent and purpose, a Docker file that would be used to build any Docker image. I'm passing some arguments in here. It's just specifying that this is a .NET 5. But then because it's a Docker file, I can do whatever else I want. Do I need to install Node? So it's got this one has the provisions to installing Node, provisions to installing the Azure CLI. And we've ended up across where I didn't want to be. So we can install the Azure CLI. We can install anything else that we need. Like I said, you can install like a Mongo instance as well and have that set up and ready to run. Then inside of our devcontainers.json file, we define, well, this is how you're going to get your image. You're going to build it from this Docker file, or you can pull from an image from a registry. So if you wanted to do that, save them doing a local build of the image. Any arguments that you need to pass through if you're doing a local build. Any settings that we want to find. So this is just going to say, well, we're landing in a Linux environment. So here's the default shell that I want you to run. Extensions that are going to be pre-installed into that environment. Ports that we want to open, because this is Docker, I might need to expose some ports. And what you'll notice in the sidebar over here is that I don't have things like my Azure extension or my Docker extension, because inside of this dev container, I haven't installed those. So this has only got what I need to work on this project. So it's a nifty way to simplify someone onboarding onto a particular project. Again, if you want to learn more about dev containers, I've popped a link into the Slack chat for that. Now, with dev containers, and I've also been using WSL a bit there, you might have noticed, This brings me onto the topic of remote development. VS Code is actually designed in a way that remote is something that was very possible to do. It was actually originally built to be a browser-based editor only. That's why it's built with web tech. But it's become a desktop application because that was where the industry was at the time when VS Code was first released. It wasn't quite ready for a web application. But by designing it the way they originally did, they could support this concept of remote development. Whether you're working on Windows using WSL as your primary development environment, and you want to be able to still treat that as though you're working directly on the WSL instance, or you wanted to connect to a Docker container, maybe you've got somewhere that's remote, like physically remote to your machine, you want to SSH into it. I have some Raspberry Pis on my desk that I use for IoT work. Well, I can SSH into those. I can then use the like VI or something like that to edit files, but then I'm struggling to get back into the muscle memory of remembering how I work with those editors. Well, no, I can open up an SSH connection to work with VS Code, and then I get the full editor experience of VS Code, but I just so happen to be running that remotely on a Raspberry Pi. And then all the compilation and things like that happen there. So the way this is done is VS Code is broken down into two main components. We have this UI process where things like our themes and other UI-centric extensions are operating, and these don't need to understand about the underlying host environment. This then talks over the extension host process to the things that are actually working with the host system. So it could be your compiler, like TypeScript or .NET or Java or whatever it might be. Could be linters or code formatters, things that are working with those files on the file system. They're actually running on a remote environment, and it's talking over a socket connection between the client process and the host process. And then these are able to talk to things like our source code, our terminal process, running apps, debuggers, etc., that are running on our underlying host. Again, I popped some more information around how remote works into the Slack channel. But the best way to illustrate how we can do remote development is Codespaces. So Codespaces is currently in beta. The link to sign up for the beta I've popped into Slack for anyone that wants to use it. But, well, it's basically VS Code in the browser. And the best way is that I jump over and show you it in action. So this is a GitHub repo of mine. There we go. Let's just zoom that in. I forgot to do that beforehand. My apologies. And if I was to click on code, while I have the normal, like, open with GitHub Desktop, open with VS Code, here's the clone information. I also, because I've got access to the beta, I have open with Codespaces. So I can click over here, and then I can create a new code space for this repository, or I can connect to an existing one. Now, I've got an existing one. We're going to use that because it will take a few minutes to start up otherwise, and I don't want you to sit there just kind of watching someone click around and just like screen spin. Okay, here we go. So this is the one that I have, here's one I prepared earlier. And, well, this looks very much like VS Code, doesn't it? This is running purely within inside of the browser. Actually, let's close the sidebar for the moment. So we'll just focus on just the text editor experience. We have our address bar at the top. This is just running Edge Canary, but could be running whatever is your preferred browser and things like that. And I've got syntax highlighting. I've got a red warning because the TypeScript compiler doesn't like the pound character there for the private symbol. I'm not sure why. I haven't worked that one out yet. It is valid. I can pop up the terminal and do ls. This is now, like, I'm in a Linux terminal. I can do npm start, Control P, bring up our command palette, and we type term and create a new terminal. And then we'll come into another folder. We'll go API, npm start. Oops. Mistyping start. So I can start up another process here. So these are, like, I'm actually running the Node applications in a browser or through a browser on some sort of remote environment. This is actually running a dev container behind the scenes. So if you define a dev container, that's how we'll set things up. But, well, possibly see, it'll be easier if I go back to term one, that I have a website running at localhost 3000. Who's localhost though? Like, this ain't on my machine, so this is not my localhost. Well, what happens is that Codespaces will do a remote proxy so that my application is still available. So here it is. Here's my React application running. Zoom in. It's very exciting. It has a start button. This is a trivia game. if I click start, I'm going to do something, it's loading, and oh, we've landed back on there. Okay, well, I've obviously got a bug in this. So how can I fix this bug? I can open up the DevTools and I can work around it. Maybe I want to call in some support from a colleague of mine. Now, the colleague is also going to be me because it's really difficult to do colleague-based demos when you're virtual presentations and all that sort of stuff. But it leads me on to talking about another thing that we have in VS Code. And I think one of the most underappreciated bits of VS Code, or it's not just for VS Code, but predominantly for VS Code, live share. So I've got live share installed. It's an extension here in my sidebar. And I can start a new sharing session. So what this is going to do is, well, we've all been on those screen shares with a colleague trying to do some pair programming, and that you just like you want them to click somewhere. You're like, come on, just click on that link, and you just want to reach through the screen and take control of the mouse and do it because like you know what to do to fix it, but the way that you're conveying your instructions, like or your help, is just not quite working. So we can do that with live share instead. So it's going to give me a URL. I'm going to open up here, and we're going to open this in. We'll open this in VS Code. So I'm going to use vanilla VS Code, not the insiders build, just so I can show that I don't actually have anything pre-installed. So I'm going to hit open on that extension, open on that URL. So this is going to open up my live share experience. And I'll come over, we'll put these side by side, and then I'm just going to have to zoom out this editor a little bit. Otherwise, it's going to be too hard to see absolutely everything. Okay, so I'm going to continue as anonymous, and we'll just call this Aaron2. And what's going to happen is that my host, so the browser window on the left, is going to get a notification that say that someone is trying to connect to it. Eventually, we're going to get there. And do I want to allow them? Yes, I do. I want to accept them. They're going to be anonymous, so they will only have read-only access to the editor experience. But so on the right-hand side, I have my colleague that I've called in, and they're having a look. And on the left-hand side is my live experience. At least that's the way that they're laid out. I hope that they're left and right for yourselves as well. So what we can see is I've got, well, I don't actually have the code base on my desktop machine here, but I still have all these files. I can click around. I can look into the different things that are appearing, so I can have a look through all these different files. I'm getting syntax highlighting. I haven't got anything installed. I haven't got any extensions yet, but they're all there. Inside of my host, I can say follow participant, and that's going to take me to where Aaron2 is connected. We'll see there's a kind of this little bluish, aquarish cursor, and that's where the cursor is for my remote connection. As you can see, it jumps around as I'm clicking on the right-hand side. Similarly, on the left-hand side, there's a little yellow cursor, and they can be followed as well. If I was to start typing something in one of the machines, that code is immediately appearing on the other side. Also, on my on the remotely connected client, well, I had a notification earlier that said, well, there's some ports open. This localhost 3000. Okay, let's click on that. And there we go. There is our running React application. As far as it's aware, I'm running on localhost 3000, which is actually running in a remote container somewhere in the cloud. It just so happens that the way that LiveShare is working is it's proxying that down to me. I have access to the terminal, so I can see the terminal output. Well, that's a little bit hard to see because it's in behind me, so I'll just fade myself out. And if let's zoom this editor in a bit. So we've got the terminal output that's coming through. I can see the output from this one here is the Azure Functions that's running in the background. I can actually start up chat sessions. So like if I wasn't using Teams or Zoom or anything like that, I could still see what I could talk with the colleagues that I've got there. And this is, for me, this has been an absolute game changer when doing remote development, particularly at the moment where it's really difficult to get in the same location as someone that I might be working with. Just standing up a live share server so that we can easily work together. And let me just come back. Like I said, I find this really is a major game changer for the way that I can be I can help someone out. But we're nearly out of time today. So let's just jump back into our slides. I'm going to pop behind my desk again. Actually, no, we'll stay with a big version of me. We'll come back to the desk maybe a bit later on. So that was live share. As I said, it's really fantastic for doing pair programming. It's real time. It works with VS Code as well as full Visual Studio. So I could have opened that remote environment in full Visual Studio. I could even open it just with inside of the browser, which is essentially code spaces then. So I could be live sharing from code spaces to someone else that is opening it also in a browser. Now, so you could be working, like doing some pair programming with someone, and they could be running on like an iPad. They don't have to have installed VS Code. They've never had to install VS Code to now be able to pair program with me. And if I was authenticated and I wasn't in a read-only session, well, now I can actually work real time with a colleague, and they have never had to install VS Code. They have never had to download source code for my application. They don't have to have anything set up to run the development environment. They can do all of that. If I had a debugger attached, they could step through breakpoints the same as I could step through breakpoints remotely. Another thing that I could spend like a whole session talking about is VS Code Live Share. Like I said, it's fantastic. I can't speak like more highly of this as a thing to go and check out. But that is like only really scratching the surface of what you can do with VS Code. I only had 60 minutes. There was only so much I could cram into 60 minutes, but other things like you can use VS Code as your git, diff, and merge tool. I use that. I could be doing a merge in WSL, and VS Code on Windows is my merge tool, and it will immediately pop that up. So I can do a merge. So I'm running a tool on Windows to merge files through Git, which is actually running on a Linux environment. That just blows my mind that that's the possibilities that we can do now. You can provide a bunch of different command line arguments to VS Code when you launch, so that you can have it pre-install extensions like behind the scenes when you set up an environment. You can do some automation to initialize a VS Code environment for you. You can set up with multiple profiles so you can navigate between different environment configurations quite easily, or different, editor configurations, not just environment configurations. And I didn't even talk about things like it's got a debugger built in, so you can debug .NET, Python, JavaScript, Java, pretty much any language. The MS Edge team have recently released support so that you can, instead of having to use the in-browser developer tools to do your inspecting the DOM and JavaScript debugging of code running in the browser, you can do that just from VS Code itself. It's that powerful and that flexible an editor. But that's really all I had time for today. I said I could have spent much more than just 60 minutes talking about VS Code. And thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you've enjoyed the stuff that I've talked about today. I hope there has been a couple of tips that you've been able to pick up and you can take away for the work that you're doing and the way that you are using VS Code. I'd love to hear what your favorite tips and tricks are. So shout out in the Slack channel, because I'm always learning. There's always new things that I haven't yet discovered in VS Code. And if you've got stuff, I'd love to see what you can teach me about how you can use VS Code. These are where you can get in contact with me after the session. If you don't want to ping me on Slack, I'll be around for the next couple of hours. It's getting into late evening here in Sydney, so I will be going to bed before the end of NDC London. But I do hope that you enjoyed the rest of the sessions that we have today. Again, thank you, and we'll have some fireworks to finish off. I will have if there's anyone that has any questions, feel free to pop them up on chat or shout them out, unmute yourself. I think we've got a couple of minutes before I'm going to get kicked out of the session anyway.